Hi there, my name's Saeed Ahmed and I'd like to talk to you today about autism awareness. It's a condition that I'm personally affected by, and what I'd like to do is educate yourself around the condition with the hope that you learn a bit more about the condition and it will in turn help you deal with anyone you come across in your life who has autism or is indirectly affected by autism. So, what is autism? First of all, that's what I've got on screen is a description of the condition, but I've left out some gaps. So if we start off, it's actually a developmental disability, and this significantly affects verbal and non-verbal communication and social interaction. It's generally evident before age 3 that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So that's basically one way of describing autism. It is, however, sits on something called the ASD. Now, ASD stands for Autistic Spectrum Disorder, and the diagram that I've got showing on screen now shows you just how complicated this condition is. Because if you see, it ranges from ADD, specific learning difficulties, all the way through to Tourette's, gifted, depression even, sits on the autistic spectrum disorder. Now, ASD is a developmental disability where there's a triad of impairments. So what we're looking at is social communication, social interaction, and social imagination. The key point on this slide is that no two people with ASD will have the same difficulties. Asperger's syndrome, which you may have heard of, sits on the autistic spectrum, but you can potentially have two children who may be twins, who are both autistic, but they will show different characteristics. That I think is highlighted in my next slide. So basically, autism, ADHD, Asperger's, what's the difference, you may be asking? So the rainbow that I've got on screen really shows that in a lot more clarity. So it's described as a spectrum purely because you can be at one extreme. So if you look on the left, it's got extreme ability in some areas, or you can be the other extreme, which has severe learning disabilities. So you might have come across some people who are incredibly gifted, be around computing, mathematics, ability to paint and draw. And on the other extreme, you may have an autistic person, and this is in the classic autism range, who basically wants to sit in one corner, um, not really interact with anyone, doesn't like loud noises. So what you find is that it's a massive range of difficulties, which is the reason why autism is so difficult to pinpoint. But it is a spectrum. So people, I've had full-blown conversations with children in my son's class, but because they're autistic, doesn't mean that none of them communicate. My son doesn't communicate that much, but you cope with it according to the person's ability. So I've got some stats on the screen that I'd like to share, and they are hard hitting, but that's the whole point of getting these stats across to you so you can have a bit more of an understanding about the condition. So first of all, you might not realize, but the number of people affected by autism in the UK is actually 1 in every 100 people. Now, this is the ASD spectrum. So what we're not talking about is one subset of those people. Percentage of children with ASD bullied at school. Now you can appreciate, children come in and out of relationships, and at school things get tough, peer pressure, etc. But it is really, really high. 34% of children with ASD are bullied at school. The next one, also linked into school, is that children at the wrong school for their needs. Now, again, in the UK, this is actually as high as 63%. So the reason for this is that there isn't that much support at the educational level for ASD. The amount of special ASD schools is really, really limited. I live in Birmingham. We have 3 secondary schools for ASD, and you have a lot more children on the spectrum who have those needs. So what ends up happening is that a child goes to a mainstream school and gets support for ASD, and it's not always the right thing. So I don't condone or criticize anything, but it's the fact that not all children are at the right need for this, at the right school, for their needs. What usually happens is when children go into adulthood, things become a whole lot more different. So adults without access to relevant social services support is actually 70%, which is a horrendously high figure, but that's clearly because as soon as you hit 18, you're then classed as an adult. Now, the type of condition that autism is, you may get an 18-year-old person who is classed as an adult, but mentally, they may be 4 or 5 years old mentally. Their capability might be that much, but you're classed as an adult. So the level of social support is lessened at that stage. Adults feeling isolated, again, I think it's linked into the figure above, but it's 70% because whilst you want to promote independence, it's really, really difficult to have that independence without the right support. The next figure is really shocking. So, percentage of adults in full-time employment. Now, this is actually 15%. Now, the challenge you face is that there are some organisations who are working hard to link in with special schools and try and get full-time employment. But the common misconception is that they have no place in work. I've seen from my own personal experience that isn't the case. You give someone the opportunity, that allows them to shine. But unfortunately, 15% is really, really low. Now, the number of boys with ASD compared to girls is actually 4 times as many. And that's, it's just a genetic thing. There's nothing to say that, boys are autistic because of a certain reason. It's just the way it is. Percentage of teachers who feel they do not have adequate training is actually quite high again, 60%, because what usually happens is that there are obviously a lot of conditions. Teachers cannot get full training on every single condition out there. They'd never get time to teach if that was the case, but 60% again is quite high. What I now want to touch on is symptoms of autism. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a triad of impairments. So first of all, social communication difficulties. So autistic children have difficulties with both verbal and non-verbal language. So verbal language, obviously, depending on where they are on the spectrum, they may or may not have development of speech. So that's quite a common thing with autistic children, where they are non-verbal, in which case you have to adopt different types of mechanism to communicate with them. This can include things like the picture exchange card system, so PECS, the Makaton sign language. So there's a children's TV character, Mr. Tumble, which is voiced over by Justin Fletcher, and he actively promotes Makaton, which is a much simplified version of sign language. And I myself have found my son using some of the symbols because they are a lot easier to understand for children with autism, and it links into the picture exchange system. Secondly, we've got take things very literally. Now, autistic children will actually look at the words that you're saying and not really take account of what they mean. There may be words that you use for a fun joke purpose, but if you said to an autistic child, take a running jump, for example, they would run and then they'd jump because they've seen those two words in that phrase and they would take that very literally. Next one we've got is cannot read facial expressions or tone of voice. It's really difficult with a child with autism to look at facial expressions and react appropriately. In this day and age, we are taught from a very early age to look at people's expressions, find out when they're upset, find out when they're happy, and then adjust our tone of voice. Unfortunately, with autism, it is on the same level. They don't understand jokes or sarcasm, and again, it links into taking things very literally. A lot of jokes are either innuendo or they have double meanings, and that to an autistic person is really, really confusing. They're unable to take turns in conversation and only want to talk about their own interests. A couple of characteristics that aren't typical of every autistic child, but the fact is, because they are in their own world, they are just thinking about themselves. Not from a selfish perspective, that's just a condition they have. Secondly, we have social interaction difficulties. So this includes the kind of things like unable to recognize emotions or feelings, so linked into thinking about themselves. Having difficulty expressing their own emotions. So my son, for example, is nonverbal. So when he wants to express an emotion, he will bite himself, or he'll make a sign that says to me, "I want attention." But that is purely because he's nonverbal. Appear to be insensitive. Now, this isn't something that they set out to do. It's just purely a case of, they are so busy trying to sort of pick up all the sounds and noises and movements around them that they can't really compute them as quickly as an able being, and that's why they may come across as insensitive. Purely not the case, and that's not intended. Prefer to spend time on their own, and appear to behave inappropriately. Obviously, these are probably towards the right end of that spectrum, where children have mild and severe learning disabilities, characteristics typical of people with learning disabilities. The last one we've got is social imagination difficulties. So we have difficulty in understanding people's feelings. It's difficult when you're trying to compute everything that's happening around you to actually appreciate how people are feeling. Unable to think ahead and predict what might happen, and does not understand concept of danger. Again, two things that are prevalent in autistic children, where you live for today. If for forward planning, what we have done ourselves is set up a whiteboard in my son's room. So we will try and note activities on there for the future. So if we're doing something at the weekend, we will put it on there. We'll set that as a reminder. It's not a simple case of like I can do with my younger children to say we're going to the park on Saturday. If I was to just announce that on a Saturday, it just wouldn't work. So we have to do is write that on the whiteboard, and then obviously reminder every day, which hopefully starts to get the message across, but it's short, sharp bursts of information, which hopefully work. Next one we've got is finds it difficult to engage in imaginative play or role play. So because they take quite literally activities, whatever said quite literally, it's difficult to then start thinking about ideas and generating those ideas, because there is a lot of activity, a lot of brain activity that is going on in autistic children. And the two things at the bottom we've got, dislike for new and unfamiliar situations and does not like change to routine, are again typical traits of autistic children, where they do have a set routine. If you try and change that, you can. So I'm not saying you can't, but you have to kind of take things one step at a time, and not approach it with a, right, that's it, we're doing this now, because it just won't work. So next, what I wanted to talk about was common misconceptions. So these have been sort of collated from my own knowledge, some internet research. So forgive me if there's something on there that I haven't quite covered. First one is autism is caused by the MMR vaccine. So the MMR vaccine came out several years ago. Measles, mumps, rubella. It was a combination of 3 separate injections, which is combined into, you can call a super injection. There was a lot of debate to be had around the cause of autism being the MMR vaccine, and there's been a lot of research, there's been a lot of debates, and a lot of papers produced on this. There is no significant evidence to indicate that this is the case. We ourselves, myself and my wife, had a challenge because obviously our eldest child has autism, but we went through the same vaccination process with our younger children, and I'm pleased to say that they are what you can class as normal. All people with autism have special abilities. So the picture I've put on there is a clip from the film Rain Man, and it's a common misconception that all people with autism have special abilities. Now, 10% of all autistic children and adults are what they're called savants, and those are people with special abilities, but what you get is people forget about the other 90%. Every time I talk to someone about, my child is autistic, the first thing they come back with, purely because of films like Rain Man, is, well, he must have a special ability. And I respond simply by saying, yes, he does have special abilities, but he's not the savant type of abilities that you're talking about. So they're out there, and I'll touch upon a few later on, but in a limited quantity. Next one, misconception, autism can be cured. Well, there is, unfortunately, no magic cure for autism, but what you get is strategies to help people cope with the autism, to try and give them a bit of independence as they get through the years. Autism affects just children, so another misconception. Autism can hit at any age. The problem we get is that diagnosis of autism, it's only recently that it's become a lot more prevalent because of a lot more information, the advent of the internet. A lot of information flows. In the past, people just have been labelled as, special needs, or I don't really like using the word spastic, but that in the old days, it was that one label for every type of condition. Now that people are beginning to get aware, it's the realization that it doesn't just affect children. Next picture I've got is autism affected by bad parenting. So I've got personal examples where my son has been having a meltdown, and that's been seen as bad parenting on our behalf. Can't you just control your child? Or, oh, these parents have just let their child loose. Well, unfortunately, if you live that journey, that's when you really appreciate what autism is. So it's definitely not caused by bad parenting. And the last one, autism has been steadily increasing over the past 40 years. So again, as I've alluded to before, it's a lot more prevalent because it's been diagnosed a lot more. It's always been around, I'm sure, but because people were labelled with an all-encompassing disability, it's only fairly recently that people are starting to realise that there are different levels of this condition. What I want to touch on next is famous people on the autistic spectrum. So we have Isaac Newton, and these are some very famous people. Einstein. If you're in the UK, very famous singer called Susan Boyle, who came out of nowhere and has become a worldwide sensation. Now, this chap, Tim Burton. So, accredited film producer, director. Daryl Hannah, another famous celebrity. Dan Aykroyd of Ghostbusters fame. And then finally, someone you may not have heard of, Stephen Wiltshire. And out of all the people on the screen, what I just wanted to do is touch on Stephen Wiltshire. So Stephen Wiltshire is now an MBE. He was actually born in 1974. And he was mute when young and diagnosed with autism at age 3. I think he was only 5 when he started to talk. Now Stephen has a talent for drawing images from memory. And he does detailed panoramic drawings after a 30-minute helicopter ride. So I once saw Stephen on a Channel 4 documentary quite a few years ago and was enthralled by what I saw. So some of the pictures that Stephen has drawn I've just shown on screen. So as I've said before, these are Stephen's drawing. I don't accept any credit for these, but what I just wanted to depict is the level of detail in these drawings. Now, if you'll have a look on those drawings, some of the buildings, the amount of detail which you can't obviously see on the screen now, research them on YouTube or Google the images. The number of windows on each of those drawings is actually an exact replica of the number of windows on that building. And this is with just a 30-minute helicopter ride over a city. Phenomenal, phenomenal. So, feel free, look on YouTube. There's loads of documentaries about Stephen to show just how far he's come and how he goes about these drawings. What I then wanted to cover off is some books that you may want to read. So I've started reading a couple of these books and they are really eye-opening. So the first one I got is The Reason I Jump. So it's by Naoki Higashida. So apologies if I've said that wrong. We've got The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, Thinking in Pictures, and Look Me in the Eyes. So these are just a sample of books around autism, but the best thing is they are written by people affected by autism. The Reason I Jump specifically, I think Naoki is a Japanese child, and he has written the book. He's non-verbal, but he's written the book from his own perspective. So it's really interesting read in terms of how the world looks from an autistic person's perspective. The next thing I wanted to do is just touch on films that you may want to watch. So again, I've touched on it previously, but Rain Man is a really popular film. It talks about the journey that Tom Cruise's character and Dustin Hoffman's character go on. Dustin Hoffman plays an autistic adult exceedingly well. You cannot tell that this is acting. It's so realistic, and it's the journey and the relationship that builds over a number of years with those two brothers. The next one we've got is a film called After Thomas. So this was a film documentary that came on in the UK several years ago, and it talks about the relationship that that develops between a child with autism who is typical right-hand side of the spectrum, severe learning difficulties, hard to handle, and the relationship that's developed with a dog that the family actually get for Christmas, and how his behavior changes, the speech starts to develop just with that relationship with a family pet. The third film I've got is My Name is Khan. So this is an Hindi film. You'll be able to get subtitles with the film, and again, phenomenal acting from an actor's point of view, an adult actor's point of view, on how autism affects himself, relationships, and generally how he can make a change to society. And the last film I've got is I Am Sam. So this is quite an old film. I saw it many years ago before I was actually affected by autism. And Sean Penn plays a disabled father who's autistic, but is a single parent to a very bright young girl, and the journey that he goes on through the law courts when the establishment believe that he isn't a fit father to look after his daughter. So these are just 4 examples of many of the films that are probably out there, but 4 that came to mind when I started talking about autism. Support. The only thing I want to really add here is that support is available. You just have to know how to tap into it. So I myself believe in education around autism. I want to promote autism awareness, and that's the reason for producing this video. If you want any more support or help, please feel free to get in touch with me. I am on Twitter at SA098, so Sierra Alpha 098, and I just want people to talk about autism and become more aware of it. So thank you for listening. I hope you found this video really useful, and I hope that you can learn a few things from it. Feel free to pass it on to others. And as I say, all rights are acknowledged. So I've talked about some films and books. None of that is my work, so I don't take any responsibility. I just wanted to highlight some excellent resources that you can try and tap into. So thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.